Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Concussion Nerds podcast. And today we are talking about when recovery stalls and how we look at and work with and treat and manage persistent concussion symptoms. So, if you're new here and you're new to me, persistent concussion is ultimately what I treat a lot of. This is where my clients fly in from all around the world. People have been on this journey that connect with me, usually anywhere from, yes, we do acute, but up to years. And by years, I mean like 10 years later. And we're helping people in this persistent stage. So if you're someone on a journey and you're hearing this, please know that it's never too late and there's always hope for improvement in your life and this journey that you're on. Now, just before we actually get to the when recovery stalls, what do we have to look at differently with persistent concussion? Let's actually start really quickly with the first piece of this for us to help somebody to not reach persistent stages is proper acute concussion. Okay, like this is step one. When we talk about setting this new standard for concussion care around the globe, because that is the mission we are all on here, right? We are setting a new standard for concussion care around the globe, and we are doing that together. But when we talk about that, that starts with acute concussion. And that starts with proper acute concussion management. And yes, we will throw some more podcasts in here coming up down the road about acute concussion and treatment and what that looks like in more detail than we have in the beginning of when we started this podcast, actually. But when you look at the research over and over and over again, it says that basically quick access to a concussion-specific clinic improves the rate of recovery. Right? There's studies that were done in 2019 and 2020 all around that say delayed access to specialized concussion care greater than 7 days increases the length of time of recovery. Right? There's guidelines out there that our physicians follow that just give really general guidelines on how to support someone coming back from concussion. But truly, we want you working with someone who is skilled and knowledgeable in this area, and this is their focus. And if you have an acute concussion, we want you in that clinic in front of that person within 7 days. Ideally, in my world, day 3 or 4 is amazing because then we can support you appropriately from the beginning. And we can put the right care in place from the beginning. And we can set you up on the right foot to help decrease that possibility of it shifting into a persistent concussion stage. Now, persistent concussion, when you start to pull up some of the statistics around persistent concussion today, they're saying that, greater than 50% of individuals are still not back to their functional baselines 6 months later, right? So there was an old stat that said 80% of individuals recovered within 2 weeks. The newer research is not supporting that. The newer research is sharing us that it is greater than this 50% that are still struggling 6 months down the road. Now, where the research is finally starting to kind of delineate and like break things down a little bit is in the mechanism of how concussion's happening, right? So a lot of the old research we have to remember was done on sport-related concussion. And in my clinical experience, sport-related concussion heals and recovers faster than concussions that stem from motor vehicle accidents, abuse, assaults, falls even, right? So when we start to look at some of the research now, some of the research is starting to look at concussion from motor vehicle accident versus that from sport-related concussions. So we always have to remember there's multiple factors in concussion healing and recovery. And when someone is shifted into a persistent stage, especially if it's been, especially if it's been months or years. Okay, so if you're a clinician and you're working with an individual or they come to see you and it's been months or years, generally, it's not just one thing, right? So I'm going to give you kind of a high-level walkthrough of a model that I teach in my Rethink Rehab workshop, right? So if you are a clinician and you are looking for that framework to help you kind of have that structure to move forward so you know what to do with all the information, you have that beginnings of that integrated multi-systems approach to really up-level your competence, check the show notes below. There is a link to come join us. This is also what I teach in depth in my Concussion Nerds program. But when we're looking and working with someone with persistent concussion, I say this again, it's not just one thing. And so typically when individuals come to work with us, it's because we're physical therapists or chiropractors or osteopaths or whomever might else be listening to this, but we're in the physical rehab space, right? So they come because they want you to assess their function and then help them rehab. So for most of us, that looks like you might be a vestibular therapist, or you might be a neurooptometrist, or you might be a chiropractor, or you might be an RMT, or you might be someone that works within like the concept of the body, neurology, the physiology, and how it functions, right? That is how so many people end up in front of us because that's our role in a lot of places. But I want you to picture a triangle, right? So in this triangle, on that one arm, you have physiology. But on the bottom of the triangle, you have psychology. And on the opposite side of the triangle, you have lifestyle. I'm going to talk about how these interplay. Because in the middle of the triangle, you can picture your client, and on the bottom, they are stuck. And our goal is to move them from stuck to excelling. And sometimes we can do that with the physiology approach. But what happens when you have that client that really just can't tolerate what you do very well, right? As in you try to do your intervention, you know there's vestibular dysfunction, or you know that there's ocular motor dysfunction, or you know that there's autonomic challenges, and you know you want to do the rehab to help them, but they just can't tolerate anything, right? Or you're that client, if you're listening to this, that you go to an appointment because it is supposed to help, but you feel like you've been hit by a Mack truck after like 10 minutes or 30 minutes of treatment. I always say we need to make sure when we're working with our clients with persistent concussion that they have the capacity to integrate the work we do with them. Now, when you look at that research as well, they typically say when people are going into persistent concussion, it is usually because an element is that there's an issue in one of these other systems, right? So when we're looking at that integrated multi-systems approach, this is why we must assess the 7 different kind of profiles of concussion. When we're looking at vestibular, autonomic, visual, cognitive, we also assess the somatosensory system, headaches, all these different elements. Because typically what happens when someone is in a persistent stage is that something in that physiological element has also been missed. And it might have been missed because they haven't received care at all. It might have been missed because their initial plan of care was under a neurologist or a physician, and it all started medication-based. It might have been missed because they saw a therapist who may have had their best interests at heart, but was unfamiliar with what they didn't know in treating concussion. And so these other systems were left untouched and unscreened and untreated, right? So we definitely want to, when we're moving into that persistent stage, ensure that either you are somebody who has this skill set to do a multi-systems approach, or if you're someone on the journey that you're seeing somebody who has the ability to do the multi-systems approach. And I also say typically in persistent is also where we need to be able to understand and have some depth. As the therapist, we need to understand how to look a little bit deeper at each of those systems to understand what's working well and what's not working well, which means your vestibular and ocular motor assessment is so much more than just a VOMS, for example. I feel like I rag on the VOMS so much. It absolutely has its place and its validity, but it's not enough. It's a screen. It was developed. It's a really amazing screening tool, right? And for so many therapists, that is a lot of their assessment, and it's just not deep enough. So when we're working with many persistent clients, from a physiology perspective, when recovery is stalled with what we're already doing, we have to have that ability to look deeper at each of the systems, as well as ensure that we are looking at all of the systems and looking at what's working well together, what's not working well together, and how are they playing in the sandbox, right? So that physiology piece is one piece. But again, let's go back to that concept of, does our client have the capacity to integrate the work we want to do in the physiology space? And sometimes they just don't. right? Sometimes as a client, you can want to do this work so much because you know that it should help you, but you don't have the capacity to do it. And what do I mean by that? That means that every time again, I've said this before, but every time we go to do that treatment, your symptoms flare on like a few reps, or you feel like you've been hit by a bus for days after, right? Or that sort of thing. You're throwing up after every treatment session, right? So now ideally, you can scale and dampen and like reshift the weighting of how those therapy sessions are doing. But sometimes we need to take a step back and look at, why don't I have the capacity to begin with? So step one is like, let's step back and have some awareness that capacity might be an issue, that there's potentially other factors taking up the space of your nervous system and the space of kind of your emotional capacity and just the space of you that is limiting the ability for you to integrate the treatment that you're paying for, right? I picture it kind of like a bucket. And I'm going to draw with my hands here for those watching the YouTube clip of this, but you're just going to have to picture this. But picture a bucket and picture where that water level sits, right? Someone who has very little capacity, that water level is almost kind of like brimming at the top of the bucket already, right? When we are over capacity, we're spilling water out of the bucket. So if your starting spot is already that water is like just below the brim of that bucket, any additional stressor or potential therapy is going to spill you over the top. Right? And so what we need to be doing as a therapist working with our clients and as a client is look at that first question becomes, how do we decrease the water level in our bucket so that way we have greater room to fill it, which is the capacity to integrate the treatment. And so sometimes, and this is why, you guys, when we talk about concussion care is individualized and it's not the same thing for any two people, that's because sometimes that capacity changes with the rehab. But sometimes that capacity shifts because we have work we need to do in other areas. And so sometimes that might be looking at our psychology. And by psychology, I'm talking about previous trauma, current trauma, and how that impacts your nervous system and its ability to respond and move dynamically through the states of your nervous system, right? What is your mindset and your self-talk, right? How are you showing up in this way? Are you in a fear avoidance space? Are you ignoring anything and pushing through symptoms? Are you showing yourself self-love and self-compassion? All of these factors are going to absolutely contribute to your capacity. When you look at the lifestyle side of things, I'm saying these are the low-hanging fruit for you. Please recognize, I know that it doesn't mean it's easy, right? But this is also, especially the lifestyle pieces, is where your magic bullet is consistency, right? Sometimes the best things we can do for ourselves are the least sexy. They're boring, but they need to be done. And so in lifestyle, this is looking at things like, do I have a morning routine to begin with? And this doesn't mean it needs to be some big, huge, elaborate thing. It just might be getting up in the morning, getting yourself a glass of water and taking 4 deep breaths while you look at yourself in the mirror and smile. Right? This might be, what do you do for yourself to help process emotion and move your body and move energy in a positive way? For me, that's going to the gym. For other people I know, that's doing an adapted yoga class. For others I know, that's taking their socks and shoes off and rooting their feet in the ground and doing some breath work. Right? What are you doing consistently for yourself in the day that we know helps to guide that nervous system to be more dynamic and to not live in a resting fight or flight or shut down state, but more towards a state of calm? And that is responding more dynamically and appropriately. What are those practices you're doing to encourage that? What does our sleep look like? Sleep is huge. And if our sleep is really impacted, what are we doing to try to take steps to improve it? How is your nutrition? Are you someone that's eating a lot of processed food? Are you eating out all the time? Are you trying to eat a whole diet? Are you working to keep those blood glucose levels stable so we're not getting spikes and drops in glucose levels, right? What are we doing there? Who are the people you're surrounding yourself with? When you sit down with friends, do you talk about how horrible life is and how much you hate your concussion and you wish it would just be done? Or do you talk about things that you could look forward to in the glimmers and have real conversations, but not ones that drag you down a doom spiral? I know I harp on these things all the time, but it's because they all matter. And when we don't have the capacity for the physiology piece, or we don't have the room to integrate the treatment that you might have when you see someone like me, sometimes that means we need to start with these other areas first. As a clinician working with someone in a persistent recovery path, how we start to shift them out of that stuck place depends on these three pieces. Your biggest skill set is likely in the physiology department, but in that physiology department, you need to have that skill set to go deep, to look deeper, to look at all of the systems and how they interact together and understand how they're speaking. But we also need to look at that lifestyle and that psychology piece. And if you can imagine this triangle, now draw one big circle around that whole triangle, because we need to be doing all of this on the foundation of feeling safe. I just want you to think for yourself, what makes you feel safe? Think of the people that you have interactions with in your life. Who is somebody in your life that when you're with them, you feel like your shoulders relax, there's just a smile on your face, you might laugh a little bit, but you can just let things flow. Think about that person, and now think about what is happening in that interaction. What is it about that person or that moment that you're remembering that makes you feel that just, right? Our brain is this concept of neuroception. Our brain, it intakes information about our environment, about our visceral information, about our body information, and it makes a decision on whether we're safe or we have a threat. And so there's so many unconscious things we can do as providers to create an element of safety. And neuroception and that unconscious perception of threat or safety will shift our client's physiological state. What do I mean by that? If our client comes into a clinic, there's music playing, bright lights, it's really loud, there's people rushing all over, they feel like they've annoyed the front desk person, right? Those cues are likely going to shift their physiological state into one of hypervigilance, alert, primed to fight or flight. Versus someone who walks into your clinic, there's no music playing if you have a concussion clinic, I hope. No music playing. It's calm. Person at the front desk smiles, says, "Hi, how are you?" Usually says their first name. Your therapist will just be 5 minutes, but if you want to have a seat, we'll be right with you. There's a space where they can sit, relax, put their feet on the ground. They're not consciously thinking about all those things in that environment, but their nervous system and this process of neuroception is taking all those pieces in and deciding they're safe and shifting their physiological state into one of more safety, which in turn increases their capacity. We have a client, she's a bit of a data geek like I am, and I love it. And she'll send me snapshots from her Aura Ring data of when she comes to the week. Or sorry, when she comes to the clinic. And it's so interesting to see where her resting heart rate tends to sit. And then literally she comes into the clinic and her heart rate comes down. And it stays down through her treatment time. And then it continues to stay down for several hours after her treatment time. And then sometimes it'll go back up. But that is so cool to see that data of that is simply her feeling safe and her body truly shifting physiologically to that unconscious feeling of safety when she walks through our door. So if you are a clinician working with individuals with persistent concussion, any concussion, honestly, any client of any kind in any clinic, we need to be taking stock of how we are setting up our spaces, of how we are speaking, of our tone of voice. Is there consistency and congruency between your digital communication, what's written on your website, and how you and your team are showing up? All of those factors and many more contribute to this unconscious perception of safety. And it is absolutely a way that when our client comes in, if unconsciously our nervous system's like, oh, I'm in a safe spot, we get increased capacity so you can do the work you want to do. I go into so much more about all of this in the Rethink Rehab workshop in Concussion Nerds for those clinicians that are interested in taking and understanding how to go that deeper route. And I'm wanting to be more confident in working with your persistent concussion clients so that when they start to tell you their list of symptoms, you sit there, you listen, you process, you have a flow, you have a framework to move through that helps guide you moving forward to see faster outcomes in your clients and you feeling confident about that. Persistent concussion is not just one thing. Persistent concussion cannot take a cookie cutter approach. And we need to be looking at that triangle that is encompassed in that circle. Remembering that that triangle is physiology, lifestyle, psychology, moving our client from stuck to excelling in the whole interwoven circle of creating a foundation of safety. I hope this was helpful to you today, my friends. Until next week, we'll see you soon. That's today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you liked what you heard, give us a like, give us a share, give us a tag on Instagram, and please never hesitate to reach out. We love communicating and connecting with you. Until next week, my friends, have a marvelous day.